I'm Ailin Darling.
And I'm Hannah Glaver.
We used to work together at an evangelical church that held a hierarchical position on gender roles.
A church that believed God had chosen men to fulfill the primary roles of spiritual leadership.
This environment created some unique and significant challenges for us and the other women among us as we strive to pursue our respective callings.
From wage gaps and androcentric hiring practices
to sexist standards and marginalizing expectations.
We've reconnected to explore and process our experiences as well as the systemic issues behind them.
And hopefully, we'll shed some light on why gender hierarchy can't represent God's best for women, the church, or humanity.
This is Stained Glass Ceiling.
I'd stood alone in the women's restroom and stared at myself in the mirror for a long time. My cheeks were bright pink from a swirling mixture of emotions. Shame, anger, disbelief. I loosed a button at the neckline of my black and white blouse and considered how it looked. Inappropriate? Slutty? Wrong? I wasn't sure, but I knew for certain that when getting dressed that morning, I hadn't meant to look provocative or desirable. Minutes earlier, I had been in a service planning meeting at work, taking notes on behalf of my boss, the communications director. Suddenly, I noticed him gesturing covertly at me with small hand movements. They hovered like a magician's flourishes around the area of my chest. I realized he was pantomiming the fastening of a button. I acknowledged his efforts with one raised eyebrow, not understanding what he wanted. He switched to moving his index finger up and down the area of his neckline, then ever so slightly pointing toward my own. His intention dawned on me with a surge of shock. I fastened the button on my shirt without another thought, scanning the other faces at the table to check if anyone had caught this exchange. Mercifully, everyone's attention appeared to be elsewhere. My boss gave me a subtle thumbs up. Now I looked okay. After the meeting, I followed him back to our corner of the office. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you," he said once we were away from the others. "What were you thinking dressing that way? Did you do it on purpose?" "Of course not," I responded woodenly. Truthfully, I couldn't remember how many buttons I'd chosen to fasten that morning. "Okay," he said, and went into his office. I darted straight to the restroom, thinking I might be close to tears. None came, just the hot, vivid flush on my cheeks. By the time I looked in the mirror, I already wished I'd had the guts to answer my boss differently. I wish I had told him off and pointed out that I believe shaming and sexualizing a woman's body that way posed a greater threat to harmonious Christian fellowship than an inch of cleavage.
All right, welcome back to another episode. We have a lot of ground to cover. We have modesty codes, wage gaps, and celibacy pledges. Our goal is to explore our experiences with these things in hierarchical environments and some of the very personal, spiritual, and life-altering consequences that they have on women.
Well, for this conversation, we are bringing a third voice into the mix. It is our third producer, the amazing Kenya Feldes.
Hi.
So Kenya, you also worked with us at the same church as Hannah and myself.
I did.
At the same time for several years.
Yep. I started working for the youth ministry alongside the pastor of youth, who happened to be my youth mentor in high school.
Like I said, we worked at the same time. So, one thing that stands out keenly about your experience is you changed roles quite a few times.
Sure did.
So, for the most part, you worked in sort of the administrative side of the church, and you worked for the youth department.
Yep.
You worked for the pastor. He was on the executive team. So it was an executive level pastor that you assisted for
Community development, to be more
specific.
Yeah.
You worked for facilities, and you worked for a bit for me in communications.
I did.
Yeah. All that to say that, you have quite a bit of experience with some of the very same issues we are talking about now. So welcome, and we're glad to have your perspective in this conversation.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
We were just having the conversation right as Ailin was recording this. This is the first time I've actually heard this story from you, and I was actually really surprised at the person that you were referring to. because I've known this person to be a very liberal guy. He was a touring musician for a long time, like very artistic. I was just very surprised to hear that he was kind of leaning into this whole modesty conversation.
The sense I get and have since talked with him about is that because we were in a male-dominated work environment and a conservative work environment, he thought that I needed to meet those standards in order to succeed. So my understanding of it is it was almost a strategy to get me to succeed in spite of the systemic marginalization and the systemic sort of subordination women were facing in that environment.
I think that's really fascinating. A person coming in with limited to no church background, even then knew that we had a really rigid set of modesty codes. And I was raised in this world, but it's crazy that he's like being introduced to it and knew to make sure that you knew to survive in this. Like the fact that a newcomer knew to that level what needed to be done.
Yeah, it speaks to a very quick education into that environment. And it also always struck me as very interesting that that was sort of the strategy he came up with, you know, like, oh, instead of trying to change this system that I view as problematic, let's set you up to do the best you possibly can in the system. And so you need to button a certain amount of buttons on your shirt. You need to dress a certain way. On the other side of things, I was pretty primed to receive what happened in that episode as pretty normal because the subjective and misogynistic standards of modesty that are pretty common in Christian culture have been a part of my life since very early childhood. So at the time that happened, I was an administrative assistant at our church, and I wasn't the only one receiving messages about the appropriate ways for women, specifically, to dress at work. Kenya, you actually have an experience related to that.
Yeah. When I was on staff at this church as an administrative assistant, we had an amazing executive administrative assistant who I looked up to a lot. She was an older generation, a lot more conservative. I was 20, maybe 21 at the time. We would meet once a week to pray together and sometimes talk about business. It was a little loosey-goosey. And there was one meeting at the start of summer with a group of women, primarily single women, I would say. She randomly, and not so randomly because it was the beginning of summer, brought up dress codes in the workplace. It wasn't completely out of the blue because this is what I grew up with. I mean, I grew up in the purity movement. And so I was used to these narratives. I actually, looking back, can't remember a time that I ever felt not ashamed of my body. But as far as a job goes, this was new to me. We talked about the ways that we can be modest during the summer to keep our fellow pastors, who were primarily all men at the time, in line with their own sexual wellness. And it was my responsibility to help them along with that.
So I guess, first of all, did she mention any specific rules like, okay, no spaghetti straps, but, you know, cap sleeves are fine or whatever? Or was it like literally just think about your male brothers in Christ when you get ready in the morning?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It wasn't necessarily like, make sure your fingertips hit your, like the skirt line.
Right.
No, it was very much so you are surrounded by male pastors who are trying to live a life of ministry, who are married, and it was up to me to help them withhold that, especially as, you know, a young, I say this with all humility, attractive single woman in a role where I'm working directly with multiple male pastors. So,
right, because they weren't getting that education, right? Like I think you even mentioned one time when we were talking about this that we did have maybe one male admin at the time, and he was not included in this meeting.
And he was not, and I don't know if that was, you know, summer, people take vacations. I really genuinely don't remember why he was not present, but no, he was not there.
It sounds like it would have been awkward if he had, to be honest, based on the content of that meeting. But
don't wear too short of shorts.
But that's not a thing.
I know.
I've had a similar experience in a different role, but it was handled very differently. We got an email at the start of every summer with kind of more specific roles, like no spaghetti straps, sleeveless is fine as long as it's thick enough and everything. And honestly, the outcome of that, again, well-intentioned and done by the most like caring figure on the staff that we all trusted and loved and respected, and she cared for us so much. But the impact of that email after swapping stories with a bunch of female coworkers was, that's about me, isn't it? I wore something and they had to write this email. That's immediately where all our minds went.
Yes, absolutely. Because there's so much shame involved with this conversation that you instantly isolate yourself within it and assume that you're in the wrong. And I remember being in that meeting. I mean, it is summer. It's not like it's May and we're getting ready. It is summer. We're already hot and sweaty. And I remember looking at what I was wearing and being like, oh my God, like, am I causing my boss to sin because of whatever I'm wearing? So there's no way that you couldn't internalize it as this is something about me and my own body, especially as a woman growing up in the church. That is the narrative that you're taught, is that your body is problematic.
Mm-hmm. Particularly adolescence, where you're getting reacquainted with your body as it kind of evolves into this different thing, rather than learning that it's like sacred and a useful tool from God. You're learning that it's a potential enemy and a potential source of sin and ruin and all these things. That's very impactful on like a spiritually formative level. Man, what you said about like responsibility as well, just kind of this idea of protecting male sexual integrity is our responsibility. That feels like a practice that's been rampant for generations. And again, it has these deep spiritual implications for women as they participate in church, in work, in ministry.
Did you guys ever have any situations where you were told to correct? I mean, Ailin just shared a story, but have you, Kenya, had any situations where you were told to correct something about your wardrobe, whether in school or place of work?
Yeah, I definitely have experiences growing up in a more conservative Midwest environment. Whereas, like where we live now, Portland, as far as churches go, there's a lot more liberal influence within the church. And I would say that the church that we worked for was a lot more on the liberal spectrum in a lot of ways. But shame still existed in those places, even though they were claiming to be liberal. And I experienced that in youth group, especially as it relates to summer camps, what I was expected to wear as a teenage girl. It was part of the permission slip that I had to sign. Nowhere was there anything about what my male teenager friend had to wear as far as swimsuits go. There was a lot of shame around women's bodies that still existed within these so-called liberal settings.
Swimsuits is such a great example.
Yep.
I was raised in a very similar environment, and one thing that looking back is really like cloudy and nebulous about it is that each sort of faith community or institution that I was interacting with had different expectations about what constitutes appropriate dress.
Yeah.
And a lot of them like weren't written down. But you were expected to know what the unwritten expectations were. And with the example of swimsuits, it went everything from you wear shorts and a shirt over your swimsuit unless you're actually in the water, to only one pieces, to no, you wear a t-shirt over your swimsuit the entire time while you're swimming. And again, these were all women specific codes. Men did not have them when it came to swimsuits. Straps was another one. Some sleeveless is okay, but you need to have at least 2 fingers there or something.
3 fingers.
Yeah, 3 fingers, you know, whatever. Like a labyrinth of expectations without much thought to, one, how challenging it is to navigate that as a young person, like in planning your day and things, just anticipating what your body is going to do in your clothes as you just move through the things you need to do throughout the day is ridiculous. Another thing that came to mind when you were talking about youth group in particular is, as an adult, I remember having conversations with the male pastor staff about how distracting it was, say, when the youth was facilitating communion or the offering, and a high school girl would be wearing something that was distracting to these men, and they're kind of have meetings about, like, what do we do about it? And the thing that always came to mind in those conversations was, a little bit humorous, but in our staff meetings, sometimes when the men sat down, their crack would be exposed. And if you're sitting behind them, you'd kind of get a little bit of a glance at the moon kind of a thing. Half moon. And I mean, I never once thought about addressing it, right? There's this kind of grace of like, he doesn't know what those pants are doing when he sits down. I'm sure if he knew his ass was showing, he would, pull him up or whatever. But you have this grace. And so I'm like, why can't we have the same grace for these girls rather than pointing it out as a distraction and making sure it's a problem that is solved?
That reminds me of a story of when I was studying abroad in Africa, and modesty codes were a little bit different there based on kind of culturally what was sexualized. And in the area where we were, legs were very much sexualized in women, so everything had to be covered. It was incredibly warm. We were on the equator. It was safe on our compound to wear shorts. In the privacy of our own home, it was okay. And I remember having what I thought to be like long soccer shorts. And I remember being corrected and being very embarrassed and walking into the next room, and someone else who was wearing much shorter shorts was not being corrected, and she was so much thinner than I was. And so I think based on just like the mere size of my body and certain parts of my body, my modesty was in question. So it wasn't even an issue of this 3 fingertip rule for tank tops or a certain length for shorts. It was literally the size and shape of an individual's body. I've only ever been my soft, wonderful self. But honestly, that shouldn't be the point.
Yeah, it speaks back to sort of that cloudiness of expectations goes down to the individual woman. Mm-hmm. Like I remember when I was a child, sort of this mandate for modesty that I understood in the church seemed pretty simple. Like, oh, keep your private parts private, easy, right? Then I grew up, things got less simple. My body changed, and governing exactly like what the more emphasized parts of it looks like and everything I wear, became a lot harder. I mean, pretty much everything we're going to talk about, all 3 topics of today, they're narratives that begin in childhood, in youth groups, in our faith-based communities, and we carry them with us into our workspaces when we got involved in vocational ministry. It's a lifelong weight to carry. Mm-hmm.
I work at a concert venue, and there's like a level of like professionality, and I mean, this is probably the same in any kind of like office workspace as well. And so we have standards of appearance in regards to what we wear. It's like going, if you're running a security position and you need to look official or look like you work there, that's what our wardrobe codes are about. It has nothing to do with sexualization or what your body can and can't do. In fact, you'll get fired if it has anything to do with making a coworker stumble. Like that is... It's not even a conversation. It's not a conversation of like your body isn't responsible for somebody else. It's not even thought of. I think the way that we think about our bodies, how we're taught to raise kids and especially young women to be hyper aware and hyper concerned about how they're going to harm the men in their life, and that it's their responsibility to save them.
Because that's the common denominator. The conviction that young ladies need to be taught to guard against the risks our bodies pose to ourselves and the people around us. And shame is the teaching tool of choice. So to wrap up our segment on modesty codes, I recently talked to my mom about not wearing pants. Kenya laughed, thank you. That was a little bit of a joke. But no, really, my mom has been working in ministry for more than 30 years. She's been a worship leader, music director, among other things. And she's had this interesting experience around the controversy of women wearing pants at church, so showing even the outline of their legs. We chatted about it, and we've got some clips of her story.
Hello, so I am Vera Darling, and I have been in ministry for about 30 years, been through a lot of churches. My parents came from very close-minded churches. I remember that my grandma didn't allow us to wear pants. My mom was not allowed to wear makeup. My mom came from a Brethren church, so she actually had to cover her head in church. The men usually wore normal clothing, but the women weren't allowed to wear this or that or makeup or anything that would enhance them or make them look attractive. But my dad was always ahead of the times. He was one thinker and always seeking God very personally, and I think that's how he became very up to date. He got through the barriers of women should be like this and men should be like that. So I grew up seeing a transformation from someone very close-minded or who came from a very close-minded church become a person who opened his eyes to a new generation of churches and uniting churches and things like that. And he brought that home. Yeah.
So fast forward to now. You and Dad work at a pretty large and influential church. The lead pastor has a few million followers on social media. Dad is the executive pastor there. Can you share a bit about your role in the church?
Yes, well, I am a worship leader. It's a big church, so it's very visible. It's very much on Facebook and YouTube and all kinds of things. So you're actually very exposed, and even though people don't know my name, they recognize me when they see me.
Yeah. And that visibility brings up a particular practice that I know the church has changed its mind on in the last few years because I've interacted a bit with it myself. The first time I visited your church 8 or 9 years ago, I was wearing a knee-length dress. And when I sat down, it rode up just a little bit and exposed like maybe the top of my knees. But as soon as I sat down, an usher rushed up and brought me a pashmina. And at first I thought she thought I might be cold or something, but the pashmina was actually to cover my legs for modesty reasons. And I was like, no, thank you. But I also know in that season, women on the worship team couldn't wear pants. To your knowledge, what was the reasoning behind these modesty codes?
I think mostly it was brought from the churches that some of the leadership came from. That, it was wrong for the women to show their legs, or it didn't look, they didn't want to show it on camera or whatever, since there's a lot of cameras. So the ushers, they used to carry around this blue, you call it pashmina or whatever. It's a little cloth. But, it wasn't the pastor's doing. It was, I think, some kind of culture in the church, some of the leadership that decided those things. And actually, I think the pastor was the one that said, you know what, it's ridiculous, take them off.
But that wasn't the end of the story. The church changed its position on women in pants, but some of its followers didn't approve.
So, one day I was looking through our Sunday pictures, and somebody in a comment had actually taken a picture of my part of the picture. I was wearing pants. They were pleated pants, very loose pants, but they were pants. And, he made a comment kind of like, I can't believe you allow your worship leaders to wear pants. And, and circled me. I was circled like that. And he put it as a comment. Obviously, all these other comments started coming in.
So someone went through all the trouble of screenshotting a picture of you in pants, circling your image, and posting a disapproving comment on social media.
Yeah. But, the pastor went and commented that he's the one probably that has the problem if he's noticing this thing.
What do you think it means that it's the person who had a problem with your pants who has the problem? Like, what is the problem?
The problem is, I think it's where they start judging people because you wear pants or because the women are not behaving like they should. When we think the rules are more important than my relationship with God, because in these pictures you can clearly see that we are worshiping, we're with our hands up, and then these people go and look at the pants. Oh, she's wearing pants. I think the same comes to when what is a woman's role, what is a man's role. I mean, if you see the person is doing what God's leading them to do, what do you care if it's a man or a woman?
So having gone through what you have with these modesty codes and reactions of disapproval, does that still affect the decisions you make about what you wear and how you present yourself on stage?
It does. It does affect me. I'm not that tied up to it, but I know that I still keep it in mind. It does affect me. It shouldn't, right? But I do. It does.
I think it's interesting that pants across the board were a problem when a dress or a skirt is not always going to be the most modest.
Yeah. I had a similar thought. And really the answer to that is, in the context of the denomination my mom was in, distinction between male and female is a part of the standard. So like men should look like men and women should look like women. I've heard Deuteronomy 22:5 invoked when advocating this, which says a woman must not wear men's clothing nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. So it's the idea that even today, pants are the purview of men, if you will. It's not just about sexual temptation. It delves into some rigid gender roles and like what's gender appropriate. The time has come to talk about celibacy pledges.
Yay!
So for context in this conversation, because it is a little relevant, you're talking to two single women, and I have been married for 4 years.
Has it been 4 years old?
It has been 4 years.
May the 4th be with you and also with you.
To sort of echo something Kenya shared when we were talking about modesty pledges, I actually remember another admin meeting led by that same executive admin that was kind of in charge of, stewarding us all, I suppose.
That's fair.
Yeah, she was amazing. So we were told that we as admins were held to the same qualifications as our church's deacons. And those qualifications came from a passage in the Bible, 1 Timothy 3:1-13. And this included the line that a deacon should be a husband of one wife. And then we were told that for us, again, a mostly single and female group, that this meant waiting faithfully and chastely for one husband or one wife. And I remember in our notes, there was the line, "Are you willing to wait faithfully?"
I do remember this meeting. I also, when I was hired, nobody mentioned this
Pledge.
expectation of myself. I was hired to fulfill a job.
So this did come a little out of nowhere. I mean, similarly, I do not remember these qualifications being presented with my offer letter to work at the church. But I will say that every job I've had up until my current job that I have now has included some sort of like de facto celibacy pledge, where it was made clear to me by people with more authority than I had that if it was discovered that I was having sex out of marriage, there would be consequences and my job would be in jeopardy. Complying with this while I was single was not like a huge leap for me. I never received a formal education about sex. However, I did receive a very long and thorough education on purity. So at this time, the whole concept of sex was tinged with like shame and disgrace for me. This was the least of my problems with having a healthy understanding of sex. And I know that all three of us have experience with the purity movement, right?
Yes.
In fact, Kenya, you attended some kind of purity conference or camp as a teen?
Oh, I did. I attended Pure Devotion Purity Conference. I was 11 or 12.
Very young.
Yep.
What do you remember the most from what you experienced there?
A lot of it was self-reflection on an idea that I didn't fully grasp and that I felt a lot of shame about. Speaking about porn, sex outside of marriage, especially at that young of age where we were all still trying to figure out what was going on with our bodies and what sex even was. There wasn't a lot of one-on-one time with adults who could give us the education and the support that we needed. Part of my story is that, super early on, maybe when I was 5 or 6, I was exposed to porn for the first time, so sex wasn't something new for me. I had a very worldly exposure to sex and what that looks like without the scientific or emotional education behind it. So that was hard for me to perpetuate that self-reflection and be alone in it. Some of the other things that stood out is just the teachings about my own value. I kept the curriculum that I was given and reread it a few months ago. One of the prompts was, are you a trashable styrofoam cup, an everyday ceramic mug that is easily replaced, or a valuable, priceless teacup? It made me feel like I could either be completely trash, or if I worked really hard, I could be really valuable. And it all was based on my own action, my own heart and purity. It wasn't based on anything regarding Jesus and his unconditional love for me. Looking back, there were a lot of consequences for me. I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust my body, assuming that there was something inherently really wrong with me.
Yeah, totally. I can definitely relate to that in the sense of there were some things as a teen that I experienced that I thought I was the only one, right? So struggling with masturbation, like this thing I wanted to do and did. No one else in my life was talking to me about it. So I assumed that it was something that only I did and something horrible and wrong, that I was some kind of freak of nature that was like hypersexual or something. And only much later in my 20s did I discover that that's actually a really almost inevitable thing for teens to experience. So there's this really isolating element to what we're taught in the purity movement, because it's not an education about sex at the end of the day. It's an education against sex, and that's a really different line to take.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that there is a huge gap between sex education between men and women. I think that that's true within the church. I think that that's true outside of the church. But I think in the context of church, youth group, the conversation that I had in my group as a girl was, be wary of men because all they want is sex. Be wary of men because they look at porn and they objectify you, and that's what they want. That's what they're after. They want to have sex. I was never told that humans all have sexual desire, and that it's a completely normal thing for everyone, male or female. I felt very isolated in those conversations because I often wondered, well, I also desire sex. It's not what's expected of you to desire sex as a woman, but also you're the watchdog in that situation.
One of the first sermons I ever heard at our church was focused on singleness. And in many ways, it was really encouraging to me because it was focused on singleness. The fact that they were taking time to care particularly for their single population was really meaningful to me. But what was described in that sermon was that there's this like transactional nature to sex where men want sex, so women are meant to charge a high price for it so that the result is marriage instead of like a cheaper manifestation of sexual activity. And
not that singleness could be celebrated, not that like what do you do while you're single? It's just like, ladies, don't be cheap.
Yeah. I remember being told like our job is to charge the highest price for this. And that's how we honor God and the men around us. Which was a very interesting message to receive as a 20-something professional. At that point in my life, I was pretty happy with my singleness. But I guess that brings us to like, okay, we're talking about sort of adolescence and the purity movement. And I think one of the things that I struggle with most when it comes to celibacy pledges as sort of a workplace mandate is this continuation of the purity movement's focus on sexual shame. And that while celibacy is a very common expectation for ministry roles, there's not often a lot of care or like non-judgmental conversation around the challenges of extended, undesired celibacy. And then there's the added sort of pressure and even fear around being accountable to everyone for your sexual behavior in a ministry role. So not just God and yourself, or God, yourself, and your partner, but God, your boss, your coworkers, the flock. I would say at the end of the day, the problem isn't necessarily with celibacy pledges. It's that those are largely occurring in environments where the majority experience is that of married folks, primarily married men. Most of the leaders are married men. And so you're sort of thrust into this environment where you have the threat of losing your job added to maybe the stresses of a sincere struggle with Christian ethics, becoming more and more disheartened as you find yourself leaving maybe the age you thought would be the end to your singleness, or even something different, like perhaps same-sex attraction. There's a ton of different experiences that are different from that of just a married heterosexual individual. And the problem is the lack of care around those other experiences. This idea that celibacy pledges are not easy, but doable because there's this marriage milestone end in sight. When that isn't true for every experience, there needs to be more care. There needs to be more thought into what does it look like to image God well with your sexuality, no matter what is going on.
I think we miss out on the diversity of unity when so much of the gathered church's emphasis in the support of only nuclear families. And when this is the only focus, we limit what community and family looks like in this context and the fruit and multiplicity that occurs beyond sexual union and childbearing. And I mean, like if bearing fruit and multiplying by two people getting married and having children is like the best way we can image bear, then our greatest example, Jesus himself, has failed in full. He never achieved any of those things. But I remember being frustrated that the conversation of the expectation to stay celibate, but if you were celibate for too long and you didn't find a partner, your sexuality was questioned. And it's like, you're a little too single. You're a little, I don't know if that means, are you into men? There's always a reason that you're not chosen. Maybe it's because there's something not good enough. Maybe it's because you have secret desires. Maybe there's just at the end of the day, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
But don't jump to the conclusion that just because they are still single and in their mid-30s, 40s, and up.
Right. And so there's judgment on either side.
Absolutely.
There's judgment if you fail at celibacy, and there's judgment if you're too good at it.
Yeah, I was very good. Still pretty good.
Please keep that in. So let's move on to talking about wage gaps. Now, the most common challenge I've seen and experienced in complementarian ministry environments is that men are often paid more than women because they're seen as the primary breadwinners, and women, whether single or married, are expected to eventually sort of leave the workforce and dedicate themselves to their family on a more full-time basis.
Yeah, I had a bunch of different experiences in regards to wage gaps. I mean, who's to say the truest reasons behind why I made less, and the valuing of my time and the valuing of other women's time that I saw being put in. I didn't question a lot of the wages because I thought, I'm like, this is just sacrifice. This is what we do. This is the mission. It wasn't until I was a couple years into it that I started like financially feeling it, not being able to afford it. I was told when I was promoted there was no raise going to be associated with it. I got the rate that I was given when I came on full time. On my way out, I'd been there 8 years, and so I was definitely obviously qualified, very qualified for my role. We were in the middle of hiring folks to kind of replace me, and it was going to be kind of divvied out into 3 to 4 other people. And the guy that we were going to be hiring for sound, it was casually mentioned the wage, like which was at least $15,000 more a year than I made to work 15 hours a week. And I was putting in 50 to 60 a week, and I'd been there for 8 years. When I heard how much we were looking at hiring him for and how much he was asking for, I was like, you know that like I make $15,000 less than what he's asking for, and that you're just telling me that's what you're going to pay him. He's like, yeah, but he's got to take care of his family. And I pushed back and I said, isn't my time just as valuable?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's kind of the underlying systemic challenge is that when you have a doctrine in place that says there's a male over female hierarchy, even if it's just, hey, women can't be elders, but men can, there is this sort of trickle down and women are undervalued in terms of time and resources.
Ailin, you also experienced some wage gaps yourself within your role, and then you found a way to kind of fight to get what you deserved. How can you talk about that a little bit?
I did, and I do feel like it was one of those sort of deal with it coping mechanisms I came up with to sort of navigate our environment. When I was promoted to communications director, I was offered $10,000 less in salary than my immediate predecessor had made. And I thought that this was reasonable because the church was experiencing a budget shortage and cuts were being made. So like, yeah, of course I make a little less than he did. However, despite being repeatedly told over the next 2 years that I was, the best communications director the church had ever had and was doing such a great job, a salary bump was never on the table. I asked, what does advancement look like? What does salary growth look like here? And the answer I kept getting was the only way I would make more was if I started leading volunteers, which was just not an integral part of my role in the slightest. But eventually I got married and I realized I can sort of use this to my advantage. So I called a meeting with my boss and another executive level pastor and said, hey, my family and I have goals. I've been here 3 years. I've been told I'm doing a really good job. I would like to make what my predecessor made now, please. And they gave it to me.
I think even the ways that we were kind of surprised by our promotions, or even just being hired in the first place because it wasn't expected. I felt like I was just kind of instructed to be grateful. We can't go this is who I am. I do this as a job. This is how you respect me. It seemed as being pushy, as being selfish, when in reality, we shouldn't have to fight to make the same money as the men around us.
Yeah. There's also this particular kind of invisible labor, so labor that's not regulated, not paid, and often goes unnoticed in churches, which is that you're often encouraged to use all of your gifts and talents for God, which actually means for the church community in this case. And so you find yourself contributing things that you're good at, going above and beyond your job description. But what often happens is that becomes an expectation that those results will just magically appear without any growth to your time, your authority, or your pay. And I feel like the admin role at our church was a huge sort of breeding ground for that environment where you had admins doing graphic design, you had admins doing really elaborate aesthetics for liturgical seasons and all this really, skills-based or pastoral labor and making an hourly wage similar to what you'd make at Chick-fil-A or Starbucks. So knowing we were going to be talking about this issue, I wanted to do a little research. And really what I was looking for was any statistics about what the gender wage gap looks like in a church context or in a faith-based ministry context. I didn't find anything that was specifically that. But I did find a very interesting series of studies published in the Academy Management Journal last fall by two women, Dr. Tracy Sitzman and Dr. Elizabeth Campbell, looked at how religious a society is might impact the gender wage gap. And what they found is that the wage gap is 8 percentage points wider in the 5 most religious U.S. states than in the 5 most secular states, with women making 82% of what men make in the least religious states and 74% of what men make in the most religious.
That's bad.
Yeah. They also found that the gender gap is projected to disappear in 28 years in most secular states, but not for another 109 years in the most religious states. That's, a whole generation of people. Our children will not know
Well, maybe
a gender gap, wage gap less world.
It's unreal.
You have to laugh.
I know.
I know. You want to cry, but you have to laugh. But it gets more interesting. So they, from their data, cited 3 reasons for this. And the first is that the roles of men and women are more strictly differentiated in religious societies and communities.
And in these societies, women are expected to dedicate themselves to family and discouraged from participating in the workforce, either overtly or through policy. So things like lack of a maternity leave policy. The second, which this is really fascinating and relates to the two other topics we were talking about today, religious societies are more likely to sexually objectify women and tolerate the objectification of women, which is correlated with the wage gap.
I know. I don't know. We're hearing all of this for the first time, and we're trying to be quiet, but it is bad.
And then finally, religious societies are also less likely to promote or accept women in leadership positions. So I feel like that's pretty valid to the environment we're talking about.
Yeah.
And
It just shows that's a legitimate problem. We're not making this up.
no. One thing that excited me about, that's all very discouraging information, however fascinating. But one thing that was exciting about this study was they did an experiment. They had 91 people, about half men, half women, play a game in which they pretended to be managers and they were supposed to assign wages to mock employees based on performance reviews. And sometimes the review had a woman's name, so like Hannah Glaver, and sometimes a man, like
Jeremy Bobbins.
Jeremy Bobbins.
He's this very strong male figure.
Yeah. And then sometimes the description of the mock organization described it as faith-based and sometimes as secular. And so this was really interesting. When assigning wages to faith-based organizations, the participants allotted a lower wage to female employees than men.
So it's
because it was described as faith-based.
What?
Yeah. But they were able to reverse this inequality when the organization's description, the faith-based organization's description, included women being involved as a company value and that the organization had a strict anti-sexual harassment policy. So, overtly setting the expectation for gender equality made the problem go away. It made people behave more equitably.
Wow.
That's so wild. I think what's even crazier is that, I think a lot of these faith-based organizations feel like they do have safety places and value places for women. I think because we think it's there doesn't necessarily mean it's there. I think it needs to be re-evaluated in a lot of these spaces, because if people are making that truly that much less, I don't think the value is there, nor is the safety.
I did find one other study, which was a report by a workplace data analysis company called PayScale. It's the 2022 State of the Gender Pay Gap Report. This report listed directors of religious activities and education as number 7 on its list of job titles with the highest pay gaps. So, literally what we did.
Oh. That's wild.
Yeah. I do think one of the ways our church determined how much to pay women was based on what our direct superiors advocated for. So I came in with a relatively good situation because my predecessor had kind of set a standard for what that role should make. So they only cut my pay 10 grand, right? Hannah, I don't know how comfortable you are talking about actual amounts, but I know you actually never made what I made from day one as a director.
Yeah, I made about $10,000 less annually than you did from day one, and I was 6 years into my role.
Yeah, so
And
I've always wondered, why the difference? You worked just as hard as I did. You did just as much skills-based labor as I did. I mean, we routinely saw administrative assistants who had directors who sort of championed their advancement. So you saw them promoted to coordinators. You saw them promoted to other positions, whereas admins who didn't necessarily have that champion in their direct supervisor didn't get new positions, didn't get raises. Your direct supervisor was pretty much your one avenue.
I think with each of these issues, the obvious question we're left with is, what's the solution? And I'm almost hesitant to jump into that because as I've attempted to have these conversations with bosses, colleagues, and even friends and family, there's this tendency to jump to troubleshooting the rules themselves. So what if the dress code was this instead of that, and so on. That's valid, but I think it's more important to go back to the underlying issue of hierarchy and inequality. We need to start with what's been warped about the equal status of men and women before God and do the work of unlearning to treat women as if we are objects and if our time and our gifts are less valuable than those of men. That being said, I am a huge fan of what that exercise from the gender pay gap study illustrated, that overtly setting the expectation of equality and writing that into policy leads to equitable behavior. This is why I have a hard time with the attitude, which I've encountered quite often in complementarianism, that, well, it's only the role of elder that's off limits to you, or we see this as a debatable issue. That impacts all of the dynamics because the expectation and tolerance of hierarchy is set in that environment. And that propagates things like women-specific modesty codes or a lack of care and resources for women struggling with sex and singleness. And of course it propagates a pay gap. Like, of course it does.
The other question that comes to mind, particularly with modesty codes and celibacy pledges, is what are we actually responsible to each other for?
Yes.
We talk about women bearing this responsibility for men's purity as well as our own. And we've talked about being accountable to our faith communities for our sexual behavior. And there are very valid responsibilities there. But what I think our combined stories show is that shame, judgment, and carelessness are winning out over compassion, respect, and dignity in a lot of ministry spaces. And we owe each other mutual dignity, and we owe each other mutual respect. It's really hard for that mutuality to exist when women are being sexualized, undervalued, and deprioritized. May we fight to see one another well. May we raise each other up, listen to each other's stories, and may we restore the dignity of our sisters. So a very special thanks to Kenya and Vera for sharing their stories today. And as always, to Becca and Kenya for keeping us on track, and to Ailin for mastering these tracks. Today's episode featured music off my latest record, So Far So Long, and we will list the resources mentioned in today's podcast in our show notes so that you can check them out for yourself. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes. We have some really great things ahead.